King County, Washington State. A decade of terrifying accidents.
I knew there was something wrong. Just didn't feel right.
There's just this trail of women and victims.
And they have one thing in common.
You don't want to accuse somebody of something so heinous.
Would you have done anything differently?
No, I don't believe so.
But then your gut's telling you he's a pretty up dude.
But revealing the truth is never easy.
I saw her obituary, and that's when my blood ran cold. I was panicking. I literally panicked.
All murderers are bad, but some are diabolical. Beacon Rock is the scenic gem of Skamania County, Washington. The twisting, mile-long trail to the top offers hikers a breathtaking view of the Columbia River Gorge. But on Black Friday, 1981, an alarming sound shatters the park's tranquility.
Have you seen my wife? She's 5'3", she has brown hair.
I didn't see anyone.
It's the panicked cries of 27-year-old Randy Roth.
Randy was running wildly up and down the trail, like calling her name out.
Janice!
Other hikers see Randy sort of in this frenetic, have you seen my wife? Have you seen my wife?
Janice!
4,000 acres of sprawling woodland offers plenty of space to disappear.
When the sheriffs get the call, he tells the sheriffs that they've taken a shortcut on this hike, and she walked behind him and just fell.
Janice?
This is a sheer cliff, 300-foot drop. So they immediately get all of the forces involved.
Search and rescue teams race against the fading daylight. With each passing minute, 29-year-old Janice's chances of survival slip away.
Eventually, they find her. When Randy finds out that she's actually dead, he's inconsolable.
Janice Roth's tragic fall is treated as an accident. Uncommon, but not unheard of, and devastating for her husband, Randy, whose life has been troubled from the start.
When I first met him, this was in '72. I was 15 going on 16. My girlfriend and I had walked over to a friend of hers' house, and Randy drove up in his GTO. I was like, wow. Randy was very buff, liked to wear tighter shirts, had lots of muscles. He was very assured of himself. He didn't care what anybody thought, never did.
Despite his rebellious attitude, Randy knows how to turn on the charm.
I think I was in my sophomore year. I dated off and on with him. I thought he was romantic, especially when I was with him. I fell head over heels for him.
But beneath this facade lurks a darker side to Randy Roth.
When school started, that's when I started hearing from other people, hey, did you know that he is known to be a bully in the school? If you look at him wrong, or if he didn't like what you did, they'd find the mirrors on their car broken off, or maybe their tire was flat. Everyone at school used to say, there'll be the wrath of Randy.
In 1973, fresh out of high school, Randy joins the Marine Corps, looking for adventure.
Randy wanted to join the Marines because he wanted to be a part of the action.
The Marines were the best. They were the fiercest and the best. And that was important to him.
After basic training, the Corps deploys Randy overseas. Back in Washington, Terry eagerly awaits every letter from him.
Randy would write to me and tell me that he was doing secret stuff, secret missions. They are doing reconnaissance. He liked to use that word reconnaissance.
So he's writing back to Terry. He's telling her he's on these secret missions. He's creating a whole scenario for her. All of this, of course, is a complete lie. He wound up actually working as a file clerk in the Marines, and it was very humiliating for him.
America's combat operations in Vietnam are over by January 1973, months before Randy's deployment.
He finally wrote that he was, in an office doing paperwork, and he was furious and frustrated. So he started devising a way to get out. He called his mom to see if he could get a hardship discharge, that his mom needs him, and would I help her? And I go, well, if that's what you want. So eventually got a discharge, and he came home. And then it was in December of ¡73 that we went to a very nice restaurant, and he asked if I would marry him. And I'm going, wow. And of course I said yes.
But Randy's life back in Washington is not what he hopes for.
He hated being home. It was just tense, strife all the time, and anxiety. He never kept jobs very long because they weren't going where he wanted to go. He expected 100 times more.
He expects more from his relationship with Terry as well.
There were times I'd come over and he wasn't there, and we said we'd be meeting, and I'd wait for him, and he just never showed. I started putting two and two together. One day, I went over to the house. I went in and started looking around. I went upstairs, and sure enough, there was a woman's things up there, like a woman's purse and her ID.
So he has multiple women. He's cheating on Terry. He can't help himself because his true nature's coming out.
And I was crying. I said, I can't believe he's doing this. After that incident, Randy knew that we were finished.
But Randy isn't one to take rejection well.
I could hear him drive by the house at times. He'd kind of peel the tires. And within a month or two, I drove home, and my brother was at the house, and he says, someone's broken the house. The TV was gone. There was some stuff out of my mom's, the jewelry box, and there was a few other things. So the policeman came, there was a detective, and I told the detective, I said, hey, I have a suspicion and suspect. I know who it is and why.
Terry's stolen property is discovered decorating the home of Randy's new girlfriend. Randy receives a felony conviction for second-degree burglary and spends the next 2 weeks behind bars.
He was a very dark person. You could sense it was there. You knew that he was capable of hurt.
My mother called me and told me Janice had died. Oh my gosh, I lost it. She was the loveliest person on this earth that did nothing wrong to anybody.
Hi, yes, I am calling to claim a life insurance policy.
Randy exhibits very strange behavior following the death of his wife.
Right after Janice had passed away from falling off the cliff, Randy collected the life insurance. He actually called in the very next day after Janice's death.
I'm just so broken up about it.
In fact, Randy pulls together every penny that he can.
Janice had her daughter, Jelena. She loved Jelena with all her heart and soul.
And after Janice died, her daughter was in his custody.
Janice had nightmares about her death. That's why she hid money. And she told Jelena, if anything happens to me, grab that.
Randy sees Jelena with the wad of cash, and he asks Jelena what that is, and she says, it's Mom's money. And he says, you know, why don't you give it to me, and I'll make sure that we buy some toys with it and some presents with it.
I'll keep it for now.
And of course, he never does.
A month later, Jelena's biological father claims custody of his daughter. Soon afterwards, word of Randy's odd behavior reaches the Skamania County Sheriff's Department.
I remember my mom telling the police that she feels that it was Randy that killed Janice.
So the sheriffs go interview Randy at his house. And Randy starts to tell the police a couple different versions of what happened. He tells the sheriffs that she's walking behind him, that she just slipped on pine needles and he reached for her, but it was too late and he actually saw her plummeting off the cliff.
Janice!
In another version, he says that, you know, Janice went to the ledge and was taking a photo, but in point of fact, no camera is ever recovered at the scene.
Thanks for your cooperation.
Randy Roth is no doubt an unusual man with a disturbing past. But is he capable of murder? That all depends on who you ask.
Would you have done anything differently?
No, I don't believe so. I believe I would react the same way that I did.
"29-year-old Janice Roth has tragically fallen from Beacon Rock. And there are some who think her 27-year-old widower, Randy Roth, has done the unthinkable.
My mother didn't think it was an accident, and neither did I. It had to be premeditated.
Could this grieving husband really be a cold-blooded killer? Less than a year before her fatal fall, Janice Miranda rings in the new year with her best friend.
Janice and my mom were like sisters.
So how's Elaine doing with the new school?
She's doing okay.
She was just a beautiful person, full of energy, full of love, and had compassion for people. They went to Parents Without Partners dance because it was a place to mingle.
Janice, life was not easy. She was a single parent raising a young daughter, Jelena. She was working double jobs. And she was really looking for that Prince Charming, somebody to just rescue her from her life and give her a break.
Excuse me, hi.
Oh my God.
I just had to come over and introduce myself. Randy.
Hi, Randy.
Randy Roth introduces himself as a successful local mechanic. He's also recently divorced and raising a 3-year-old son on his own.
So, you have a kid?
I do. I have a son, Gregory.
The connection between these two single parents is instantaneous.
Randy was quite a charmer. He would show interest. He would be intriguing. A little man of mystery.
Would you like to dance?
Sure, yeah.
And he would be very good at making women feel like he's going to be their protector.
Just days later, he asks her out, and a whirlwind romance begins.
Randy is the perfect suitor. He sends her flowers and love notes and just really sweeps her off her feet.
A few months after their first dance, Janice is ready to say, I do.
They gotta wake up.
Oh, they're waking up? Like, oh, you waking up?
For the first time in her life, she can breathe. She doesn't have to work her double job. She can raise her daughter, you know, the way she wants to raise her. So from Janice's perspective, it's beyond her wildest dreams.
With their vows exchanged, Randy makes certain their new family is financially secure.
Randy broaches the subject of life insurance, and he tells her, you've just bought a new house, you have a young daughter, God forbid something happens to either one of us, the house needs to get paid off, and your daughter needs to be taken care of. And he takes out a policy for $100,000.
Once the policy is in place, Randy's behavior becomes strange and unpredictable.
He's no longer affectionate, he's very distant. He starts to isolate her and starts to really make her believe that she's trapped.
Can you knock it off?
When Randy came into the room, the first thing he did was hover over Janice to make sure she wasn't saying nothing that she wasn't supposed to.
Angelina's having a bake sale at her school next week, so I volunteered to make my strawberry shortcake.
He didn't want Janice talking to us. Randy made her quit her job. He was alienating her from her family, her friends.
I would never have pictured him a physical abuser, but mentally and verbally he can be. You'd say something and he'd twist the words and it would come back making it like it was your fault. He was very good at that.
8 months into their marriage, Janice realizes she's made a terrible mistake.
She was getting depressed. She was getting worried. My mom and I both telling Janice that it's time to get out.
Sensing his wife's growing discontent, Randy comes forward with an idea.
Randy suggests that they go on a retreat and go visit his father and maybe go and try to rekindle what they had early on in their marriage. Randy was very charismatic, and he seemed to always know exactly what to say.
With the hopes of getting their marriage back on track, Randy and Janice agree to spend the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday with his father in Washougal, a quiet, picturesque community just a few miles west of Beacon Rock State Park.
I never thought in a million years that Janice would have an ending like this.
Despite months of scrutiny into Randy's shifting stories, no charges are brought for Janice's fatal fall.
The sheriffs have to close the investigation because there's no evidence that it's murder. There's no witnesses, there's no weapon, there's nothing.
The death was definitely suspicious, but nobody could prove it, and it ended up being ruled an accident.
Randy walks away from it all, a free and wealthy man, collecting $100,000 from Janice's insurance.
It was just all money. It's $100,000. That was her life.
Two years later, Randy Roth finds himself in a new predicament. The insurance payout is running low, and the hunt for another source of income leads him to another unsuspecting woman hungry for love.
Donna Clift is another single mom, 21 years old.
Hey, baby.
What?
He starts to woo her and court her, and he sends her flowers and love notes and some leather jackets and some necklaces. And so she's smitten. He proposes to her on Valentine's Day, and they marry in May of 1985, just several months after that initial meeting.
As with Janice, Randy broaches the subject of life insurance.
But Donna is not interested. And she says, I don't think we need life insurance. So she rejects him.
It's not the answer Randy wants to hear, but he has a backup plan.
Randy takes out a policy anyway, and he takes about $20,000 out on Donna.
Only 3 months into their marriage, the passion between these newlyweds is gone.
He starts to disengage. He's very cold to her, very distant. So in July of '85, Randy proposes, let's go on a trip. Let's go on a trip and maybe try to, rekindle some of this romance. They go whitewater rafting.
Another nature retreat with a new wife and no witnesses.
They were in a raft, which wasn't the most stable raft. Randy headed towards some rocks.
"4 years after Randy Roth's second wife mysteriously tumbles off Beacon Rock, wife number 3, Donna Clift, finds herself in a perilous situation.
She went river rafting with Randy.
And he starts to purposely steer the raft to dangerous waters and rocks so that the raft will burst. And then Donna and Randy come around the corner. Donna, she looks like a ghost. Something really horrible has happened.
You're trying to kill me!
She felt that he had deliberately kind of staged it so that they would be in a treacherous situation. And she thought he was trying to ram her in the rocks.
You're overreacting!
Donna tells her mom, I really believe Randy was trying to kill me. And she says to her mom, I never want to be alone with that man ever again.
After she survived that trip, that was pretty much it.
Terrified of Randy, Donna files for divorce. Over the next few years, Randy lays low and bides his time until another unsuspecting single mother walks into his life, 33-year-old Cynthia Baumgartner.
Cynthia and Randy meet each other at a Little League game. Cynthia is a very pretty, very outgoing, athletic woman.
She always was very kind and generous and very soft-spoken. We just loved her. Everybody loved her.
Unaware of Randy's troubled past, Cynthia believes he can fill the void left by a tragic loss.
Cindy had lost her husband like a couple of years. He was the most wonderful man, very kind-hearted.
She had been very well taken care of by her former husband. He made sure that she had plenty of money to support herself and their 2 sons.
Hey, beautiful.
Hi. He starts to court Cynthia, same way he did with his other wives. He starts to woo her with flowers and love poems.
I could see him meeting her and seeing something that he wanted in his life, the good, the light of it. She was a beautiful soul, totally opposite of him. And he could be charming and do all the things in the beginning.
When I saw you first, it took every ounce of me not to kiss you.
She starts to believe, as the other woman did, that this is Prince Charming has come into her life.
This is an MO with him, and he manipulates the situation to make it seem like it's better than it is.
A month after meeting, Randy proposes. A quick civil ceremony later, and he once again falls into a familiar pattern.
Just as his other wives, Randy approaches Cynthia about life insurance. He takes out a $200,000 life insurance policy on Cynthia.
Cynthia already has a policy in place. Combined, she is worth more than $350,000 upon her death.
Just as in the other relationships that Randy had, he starts to change. Pretty soon he's very controlling, he's very manipulative.
He wouldn't let her drive a certain vehicle. He wouldn't let her grocery shop and spend too much money. He wouldn't let her wear makeup or leave the house.
They weren't intimate any longer. He wasn't kind to her children. He wanted to control her. It quickly became apparent to her that he was not the man that she thought he was. The relationship wasn't going to be what she thought it was going to be. All of the actions that Randy engaged in with these women were classic domestic abuse, in the sense that he didn't want them to have friends, he didn't want them to be independent.
Cynthia starts to vocalize her unhappiness to friends, and she says, Randy doesn't have sex with me anymore. He's very manipulative and controlling. He doesn't allow me to do anything. He doesn't go to church. But she has a problem because she is very religious. She doesn't believe in divorce, and she feels kind of trapped.
By May 1991, after less than a year of marriage, Cynthia is a shadow of her former self.
She was living a very, very sad and unhappy life with him.
There was nothing about Randy that felt loving toward her or anything she cared about. All he wanted from her was complete compliance with what he liked.
With Cynthia now under his complete control, Randy makes plans for the future with someone else.
I think the thing I remember most about Randy was his eyes. His eyes were black. There's nothing there. He asked me if I wanted to go to lunch. And it was a really odd lunch.
My wife died. She fell off a mountain.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
When he was talking about it, it was just stone cold nothing. It was just, she passed away. She fell in a hiking accident and she passed away.
I see you're wearing a wedding ring.
Then we talked about Cynthia.
We were together for a year.
He said, well, they weren't really married, that it was just a contract to see how it went for a year, and now the contract is almost up.
The next day, Randy tells his wife Cynthia they need to rekindle their romance with a family getaway to scenic Lake Sammamish.
It's a beautiful lake, and it's east of Seattle as you go out towards the Cascade Mountains. The lake was very crowded that day. It was very hot out in the Seattle area.
It was high 80s, early 90s. We're not used to, 90-degree days. When the call came in, it was, I think, around 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Even to this day, 27 years later, it's clear as a bell to me. We have approximately mid-30s female. She was out in a raft in the lake. There was a drowning incident. Husband brought her into shore. We went into it thinking that she was going to survive.
I'm not getting any pulse.
I'm about ready to engage in a fairly skilled technique. Our crew is doing CPR. I looked off to my right and I saw a bystander. I noticed that he was sort of doodling in the sand, and I said to him,
"Sir, you need to back up."
And he said, with a matter-of-fact approach, "It's okay. She's my wife." And every hair on the back of my neck stood up.
"10 years after losing his second wife in a tragic accident, Randy Roth finds himself in a familiar situation. This time, it's his fourth wife, 33-year-old mother Cynthia Baumgartner, who's fighting for her life.
We've got blue lips. She's cyanotic.
I performed the endotracheal intubation, the passing of this tube into her mouth.
She's still not breathing.
And we made a decision that we need to just go.
Cynthia is rushed to the nearby hospital.
After being with her for a period of time, my experience was at that point, this was not going to be a good situation.
Despite the doctor's best efforts, Cynthia dies in the emergency room of cardiac arrest.
He's pretty emotional on some of the things we see. Her 2 children, the last thing they will see from their mother is myself working really hard to save her, while he is doodling in the sand. Just didn't feel right, none of it. Drownings, accidental deaths are investigated in King County. I was interviewed extensively, and I shared with them immediately when asked, there's something wrong about this call. She's in a raft. I mean, how could she just drown?
Tasked with finding the answer to that question is King County Detective Sue Peters.
When I arrived at the hospital, I spoke to one of the detectives from Redmond Police Department, and I learned that Cynthia Roth and her husband, Randy Roth, rode across Lake Sammamish in a rubber raft. According to Randy, what he said occurred was that she was outside of the boat and they were swimming, and at some point, Cynthia had a leg cramp, and a boat sped by and the raft flipped. He was able to make his way around the raft and found her floating face down. And he was able to right the raft, and then he pulled her into the raft and then rode back to Idlewood State Park. Randy stated that it was approximately 30 minutes to row back in.
The more Detective Peters learns, the less sense Randy's story makes.
A lot of the witnesses had been interviewed that were on the shore of Idlewood Park that particular day, and nobody actually saw a speeding boat go near him and actually flip the raft. And when Randy pulled to shore, there was nothing frantic about it. He wasn't yelling for help, he wasn't waving his arms, and the lifeguards calmly were notified that there's a problem. So there were a lot of red flags early on, and there were a lot of questions that needed to be answered. Was this an accident? Was this on purpose? I have to continue the investigation and get to the bottom of what had occurred.
As Sue Peters digs into Randy's story, the news hits the papers and stirs up long-forgotten memories.
I had heard that she had passed from one of the ladies at school that knew her through the church. And I go, you're kidding. I didn't know that. And then, 2 days later, I saw her obituary. And that's when my blood ran cold. Because I started reading it still to this day. Married to Ronald G. Roth. And I'm going, no, there can't be. And I was panicking. I literally panicked. And I started making calls.
Once Randy Roth's name got out there, our phones started to blow up.
Detective Sue Peters?
Different people were calling us, people that had known Randy from work or from his high school days, or women that had dated him in the past.
The day after Cynthia died, my heart just sunk. I knew he killed her. He had to have. And maybe a couple days later, he called me up and said that he had tickets to Reno and did I want to go with him? I said, no, I don't want to go with you. And then I called the police because you don't want to accuse somebody of something so heinous, but then your gut's telling you he's a pretty dude.
Thank you very much.
And then we learned that he had a second wife that somehow went off a cliff down at Beacon Rock in Skamania County. So that was a huge red flag.
We compared what he said about what had happened to Janice with what he said had happened to Cynthia. The statements looked like they were a pattern.
And then we started researching life insurance because Randy Roth benefited from Janice's death, $100,000 in life insurance.
There's just this trail of women and victims. Each time he gets away with it, he gets more and more arrogant. He thinks he's unstoppable. He's like the Teflon Don of murder.
As stories of his suspicious behavior pile in, Randy goes on offense, holding a press conference of his own.
I know you must have gone over it over and over in your mind at this time. Would you have done anything differently from the start of the wake that swamped your wife to the end?
No, I don't believe so. I believe I would react the same way that I did, respond the same way that I did, which at the time was an emotional reaction. I'm considerably confused, and I'm at a definite loss having to deal with the loss of my wife. We were preparing to celebrate our one-year anniversary and came just a couple weeks short of that happening. I have to reevaluate how I'm going to project my future with the family, and the media's negative coverage at this point has made a considerable obstacle for that.
As Randy takes his case to the public, detectives hit a stumbling block that could derail the entire investigation.
From Cynthia's autopsy, we learned that there was nothing in the report that indicated she had been murdered.
Without a conclusive ruling of homicide, there is little the DA's office can do.
They had taken the case initially to the more traditional part of my office. They just took a quick look at what the police brought them and said they could never make a case out of it.
This case was circumstantial evidence, and circumstantial cases are quite difficult.
Without any physical evidence, Randy Roth could get away with murder. But Detective Sue Peters has a plan.
What we did was we got the exact raft out to Lake Sammamish State Park, and we had two people inside the raft, similar in size to Randy and Cynthia, and we had various speedboats come close and at different distances, and it didn't matter how fast the boats came by the raft or what the wake was, the raft did not tip over. And so that was real critical to show that that raft doesn't easily flip, and it never did flip. The other thing of the reenactment was Randy had items in the raft that day, and he brought all of them back to shore. Towels and miscellaneous things in the bottom of the raft. Part of our reenactment was we had a bag of towels, and the minute they hit the water, they disappeared. They just sunk. And of course, he rode to shore with those items in the raft.
What he said happened made no sense. Anyone who's ever been, like I have, on a river raft and had it flip in a swollen river knows that when it flips, it creates an air pocket underneath. There's no explanation of why she would have drowned by the raft flipping on her. So none of that made any sense to anyone who knew anything about dynamics of rafts, water, or drowning.
Proving that Randy lied is not enough for the King County Sheriff's Department. In order to strengthen their case, detectives must establish a pattern of murder by re-examining the death of Janice Roth.
We went down to Skamania County, and we ended up climbing up Beacon Rock, and we did some experiments from the top of the rock. We knew the location of where her body had landed, and from the point that Randy had indicated she had went off the cliff, and things weren't lining up.
What the sheriffs have discovered is that the body is about 52 to 100 feet farther out than a person that had slipped or fallen would be.
Based on that information, there was no doubt in our minds that he murdered Cynthia and Janice.
It has been over a decade since Janice lost her life at Beacon Rock, and 3 months since Cynthia lost hers at Lake Sammamish.
In October of 1991, we finally had developed enough probable cause to arrest Randy Roth. Randy Roth was arrested on murder charges and also on theft. Later that same evening, we did a search warrant on his residence. We did a search of the crawl space, and we found a letter that was crumpled up in the back of a drawer, and that was quite interesting. It revealed really how Randy treated her. Cynthia wrote it in her own handwriting.
This letter from Cindy was a true outpouring of her heart. It was a miracle we found it.
Some of the items she wrote: Randy hates Cindy's cold hands. Randy hates Cindy's blush. Randy hates Cindy's pink feminine things in every room.
Randy hates Cynthia's lipstick. Randy hates Cindy's blonde hair. Randy hates Cindy's ugly toes. They're the ugliest toes he's ever seen. This just broke my heart when I read this.
It was quite revealing about the horror she had to live with.
With this heart-wrenching piece of evidence in hand, King County prosecutor Marilyn Brenneman believes she has what she needs. And in April 1992, she puts Randy Roth on trial for the murder of Cynthia Roth.
Motive in this case was all about money. It's all about greed. In Randy's case, he felt his best way to make money was by monetizing every single human being he could control. It's not only a murder, it's an insurance fraud.
Marilyn paints a disturbing picture of what might have really happened that day on Lake Sammamish.
My belief has always been that he cajoled her into getting in the water because it was pretty hot and the lake would have been pleasant. And she was a good swimmer. And the easiest way to handle what happened is just to tire her out by moving the raft away from her every time she got close to it. And then at some point holding her down. That's my suspicion of what happened.
The jury agrees. Randy Roth is convicted on one count of first-degree murder for the drowning death of Cynthia Roth.
I was definitely satisfied with the sentence and the guilty verdict. I'm sure if he would have got away with Cynthia's murder, there was going to be another wife in his future, and he probably would have murdered again.
The judge imposed a 55-year sentence, which means that Randy Roth will not be in a position to harm anyone else for many, many years to come.
He's a monster. With no regards for human life, those black eyes calculated and planned their death so he could gain.
He deserved what he got. I'll never question that.
Someone like Randy Roth should never be free. He was a hunter, a predator of the worst kind. He didn't see women as people to love. He saw them as dollar signs, as objects to destroy.
But the victory feels incomplete. The Skamania County District Attorney declines to prosecute Randy for the death of Janice Roth.
He should have got tried for Janice's murder. I think the words that I just want to hear are Randy saying, "I'm sorry. I killed Janice."